The wind found every crack in the prairie that winter, and the men of the settlement said later that they had never heard it scream quite the way it screamed the night the sky turned the color of a bruise and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in under 3 hours. But before the blizzard came, before the county lost count of the cattle and the church bell froze solid in its cradle, there was a young widow named Rosalind Hartwell, kneeling in a hole in the earth with dirt under her fingernails and a look on her face that her neighbors could only describe as stubborn. She was 25 years old, and she was digging her house into the ground, while the whole settlement watched and laughed behind gloved hands. Why would a woman bury her own home instead of building it up toward the sky, like every sensible family for 40 miles around? That question would not be answered for months, not until the worst storm in 4 decades swept down from the Canadian plains and turned every proud clapboard house in the valley into a coffin of ice, while one low mound of packed earth and sod glowed warm and steady as a heartbeat beneath the snow. Rosalind had come west with her husband, Edwin Hartwell, 2 years before, following the promise that had drawn so many others: land of their own, a fresh start, a chance to build something that belonged to nobody but themselves. Edwin had been a quiet, careful man, the kind who read the almanac twice before planting and checked the wagon wheels every morning out of habit rather than necessity. He had grown up on the edge of a fen country in the old world, in a family that had spent generations coaxing crops out of land that flooded every spring and froze every winter. And he carried with him a way of thinking about the earth that his new neighbors found faintly ridiculous. He used to say that the ground was not the enemy of a house, it was the bones of it, and that any man who built his home standing naked against the wind, instead of nestled into the land itself, was fighting a war he could never win. His neighbors laughed at that too, in the gentle way people laugh at ideas they have not yet been forced to take seriously. Then came the fever that swept through the settlement in the second autumn, the one that took 6 people in 11 days, among them Edwin. Rosalind buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the half-finished frame house they had been building together, a house with green lumber walls that still smelled of pine sap, and a roof that leaked in 3 places whenever it rained. She stood at that grave in a dress gone gray from washing, and she made herself a promise that she repeated to no one but the wind. She was not going to leave this land, and she was not going to freeze to death proving a point about pride. The settlement expected her to sell the claim and go back east, or to remarry quickly, since a young widow alone on the prairie was considered an emergency requiring immediate correction. Rosalind did neither. Instead, she walked the property for 3 days with a length of rope and a stick, marking a gentle rise on the south-facing slope where the winter winds broke against a shoulder of higher ground before they ever reached the house site, where the earth held moisture but did not pool, and where the sun in December would still find the door for a few hours each afternoon. Her neighbor, Otis Kellerman, a broad, sun-weathered man who had homesteaded the adjoining quarter section for going on 15 years, and who considered himself, not without reason, the settlement's foremost authority on how a house ought to be built, watched her pacing that rise with her rope and her stick, and could not help himself. "You aim to build up there, Mrs. Hartwell?" he called out, leaning on the rail of his own half-built barn. "I aim to build into it," she answered, not looking up from her measuring. He laughed. the short bark of a man who has heard something foolish and wants everyone nearby to know he recognizes it as such. Into it. You mean a dugout? A soddy? Mrs. Hartwell, those are for bachelors passing through and Irish railroad men who can't afford lumber. A woman alone needs walls that stand up proud, not a hole in the hillside like a badger's den. A badger doesn't freeze in winter, Rosalind said. And neither will I. Otis shook his head and went back to his barn, and that exchange became, within a week, the settlement's favorite piece of gossip. They called her the Badger Widow before the frost had even set in that year, and they said it with a particular cruelty that small, isolated communities reserve for anyone who does something differently than everyone else, especially when that someone is a woman doing it alone. But Rosalind had grown up listening to Edwin talk about the old country, about earth-sheltered barns that kept livestock warm through winters that killed unsheltered animals by the score, about walls 3 feet thick that never knew frost because the ground itself, 6 feet down, held a steady and patient warmth that no wind could touch. She had listened to him explain it the way he explained most things, with his hands moving as if he could shape the idea in the air between them. And she had asked him once why more people didn't build that way if it worked so well. Because it is slow, he had told her, and it is humble, and it does not look like anything from the road. A man wants his neighbors to see his house and know he has done well. He does not think about whether his house will keep him alive when the sky turns against him. He thinks about that only once, usually, and by then it is too late to learn the lesson twice. She thought of those words often in the months after his death, turning them over the way she turned over the earth itself. And by the time the ground began to harden with the first true cold of autumn, she had made her decision. She would not raise a house that fought the prairie for its life. She would build one that the prairie itself would help to keep alive. The work she began that fall was unlike anything the other settlers had seen, and it was, by any honest measure, enormous for one woman to undertake without a husband, without grown children, without hired hands she could not afford to pay. She started by cutting into the south-facing slope she had chosen, using a horse-drawn breaking plow to slice the thick prairie sod into long ribbons, the same tough, root-bound turf that other families used sparingly for walls or chimney insulation, but that Rosalind intended to use as the very substance of her home. Beneath the sod, she dug down into the earth itself, carving out a rectangular hollow deep enough that a grown person could stand upright inside, with room to spare, and wide enough for a single main room with a smaller sleeping alcove set even farther back into the hillside, where the earth's steady warmth would be deepest and most reliable. She dug for 6 weeks, in weather that turned colder by the day, her hands blistering and then callousing over, her back aching in ways she had never known a body could ache. And every evening, Otis Kellerman or one of the other neighbors would ride past on some pretense of business and see her still out there in the last gray light. And every evening they shook their heads a little more, though the mockery in their voices had begun, almost imperceptibly, to soften into something more like bewilderment. Once the excavation was complete, Rosalind faced the true test of the design, the part that Edwin had explained to her many times, but that she had never attempted herself. The roof. A dugout roof was, in the old ways he had described, the single most dangerous part of the whole structure, because a poorly built roof would either collapse under the weight of accumulated snow or let in enough water during a thaw to drown everything beneath it. She laid a framework of sturdy timber beams across the top of her excavation, salvaged in part from the half-finished frame house she and Edwin had started together, a house she had at last decided to dismantle rather than let it stand as an unfinished monument to what might have been. Over the timber frame, she laid a dense mat of willow branches and prairie grass, and over that, in careful, overlapping courses like the shingles of a proper roof, she laid the ribbons of sod she had cut months before, root side down, so that the living grass would continue to grow and knit itself into an unbroken green blanket over the entire structure. The final roof, when she finished it in late October, rose only slightly above the surrounding hillside, so gently mounded that a stranger riding past on the county road might mistake it for nothing more than a natural swell in the prairie, might never guess that beneath that grass-covered rise a home breathed and waited. It was Otis's wife, a sharp-eyed, practical woman named Bertha, who first said the thing that everyone else had been thinking but had not quite dared to voice. She had ridden over one gray afternoon with a jar of preserves, the kind of neighborly gesture that, in that country, always carried a second purpose of simply wanting to see for oneself, and she stood at the low wooden door set into the hillside and stared for a long moment at the whole strange, humble shape of the place before she spoke. "It doesn't look like a house at all," Bertha said. "It looks like the hill just decided to have a door." "That's rather the idea," Rosalind said, and for the first time in a long while she smiled. Inside, the dugout was small but not cramped, its walls the color of raw earth, packed and smoothed until they held a kind of quiet dignity, whitewashed in places with a mixture of lime that Rosalind had traded a neighbor 2 days' labor for. A small cast-iron stove sat in the center of the main room, its pipe rising through a carefully sealed chimney chase that Rosalind had built with painstaking attention, since Edwin had warned her more than once that a poorly vented dugout could fill with smoke and kill its occupants as surely as any blizzard. The floor was packed earth as well, covered in places with woven rag rugs she had made herself through the long autumn evenings, and a single small window, deep set in the thick earthen wall and angled to catch the low winter sun, let in a shaft of pale gold light each afternoon that Bertha, on that first visit, said, reminded her of light falling through a church window. "It's warm," Bertha said, sounding almost offended by the observation, as though the house had personally inconvenienced her by proving itself comfortable. "It's truly warm in here, and you've hardly got the stove going at all." "The ground holds the warmth," Rosalind said. "It always has. We just forget to ask it to." Word of the Badger widow's strange dwelling spread through the settlement that autumn the way gossip always spread, distorted and embellished with each retelling, until by November there were men in the mercantile arguing about whether she had built herself a proper house or merely an elaborate grave she intended to lie down in once the cold finally broke her resolve. Otis Kellerman, for his part, remained the loudest and most persistent skeptic, not out of any particular cruelty, but out of the deep, settled conviction of a man who had spent 15 years building things the way things had always been built, who had raised a proud 2-story frame house with real glass windows and a peaked roof that could be seen from the county road. and who took a certain wounded pride, though he would never have named it that way, in the idea that a widow with no husband and no experience could not possibly have found a better way to survive the prairie than he had. "She'll be dead by Christmas," he told the men gathered around the stove in the mercantile one cold evening in late November. "Or she'll come crawling to one of us, begging for a proper roof over her head. Mark me, a woman alone in a hole in the ground through a prairie winter. It isn't natural. It isn't right." But December came, and then the first hard freeze, the kind that split fence posts and turned the creek to iron, and Rosalind Hartwell did not come crawling to anyone. She was seen, on the coldest mornings, walking to her small barn, itself built low and earth-banked in the same style as her house, sheltering her single milk cow and a handful of chickens in a warmth that kept the animals producing through weather that froze other families' livestock where they stood. And she was seen carrying in armfuls of firewood that she needed far less of than her neighbors needed for their own drafty frame houses, since the earth around her walls held the heat of every fire she lit and released it back slowly through the long nights, so that a single modest stove load in the evening kept her home comfortable until morning, when other families were burning through their woodpiles at 3 and 4 times the rate just to keep the frost from creeping across their floors. It was in the second week of January that the sky began to change in a way none of the old-timers liked. Otis noticed it first, a peculiar greenish cast to the clouds building on the northern horizon, and a stillness in the air that felt, he would say later, like the whole prairie was holding its breath. He rode into the settlement that afternoon, warning everyone he passed to get their stock into shelter and their families indoors. And by the time the sun set, the wind had begun to rise, a low moan at first that grew, within hours, into a shriek that no one in that country, not even the oldest homesteaders who had weathered a decade of prairie winters, had ever heard the like of. The storm that struck that night would be remembered for 40 years afterward as the worst blizzard the territory had ever known, a storm that dropped the temperature from a merely bitter cold into a killing cold so severe that men caught out in it lost fingers and toes to frostbite within minutes of exposed skin meeting that wind. A storm that piled snow into drifts 20 feet high against anything that stood in its path. A storm that did not relent for 3 full days and nights. Across the settlement, families huddled around dying fires as their frame houses shuddered and groaned under the battering wind, as frost crept in thick white feathers across the inside of window panes despite roaring stoves, as drafts found every seam in every wall, no matter how carefully caulked, and turned the air inside those proud, tall houses into something nearly as merciless as the air outside. The Kellerman house, for all its glass windows and its peaked roof visible from the county road, became, during those 3 days, a place of genuine terror. Its family gathered in a single room around the stove, burning through wood at a desperate pace, watching the fire and wondering, in the particular silent dread of people who do not want to frighten their children by saying it aloud, whether the supply would outlast the storm. Rosalind Hartwell spent those same 3 days in a warmth that never wavered. The storm howled across the surface of the prairie directly above her low, grass-covered roof, and she could hear it, a distant, muffled roaring like a great animal circling a den it could not find a way into. But inside her earthen walls the temperature held steady, day into night into day again, with only the smallest, most economical feeding of her stove required to keep the space not merely tolerable, but genuinely comfortable. She spent the first day mending clothes by the light of her deep-set window, the second day rendering tallow and checking on her sheltered cow and chickens, who fared through the blizzard without so much as a shiver, and on the third day, when the wind had begun at last to lessen its terrible pitch, she sat by her stove with a cup of coffee and found herself thinking, not for the first time, that Edwin had been right about nearly everything, and that it was a bitter kind of comfort to have proven it only after he was no longer there to see it. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the prairie that emerged from beneath that mountain of snow was a landscape of devastation. Cattle lay frozen in drifts where they had turned their backs to the wind and simply stopped, unable to walk another step against it. Two outlying families, caught with insufficient wood and inadequate shelter, had suffered frostbite severe enough that a doctor riding out from the county seat would later have to remove portions of frozen fingers from 3 different people. The Kellerman barn, that proud, tall structure Otis had been so certain represented the correct and sensible way to build, had partially collapsed under the weight of drifted snow against its steep walls, crushing a section of fencing and nearly claiming 2 of his horses before he managed to dig them free. And rising from the middle of that ruined, white, wind-scoured landscape, utterly untouched, its grass roof barely disturbed beneath a light dusting of snow that had simply slid off the gentle mound the way water slides off a smooth stone, stood Rosalind Hartwell's dugout, with a thin curl of smoke rising steady and unhurried from its chimney into the cold, clear morning air. Otis Kellerman rode over that first morning after the storm broke, ostensibly to check that his neighbor had survived, though everyone who saw him go understood there was more to it than simple neighborly concern. He found Rosalind outside her low door, calmly shoveling the light drift that had gathered against the entrance, her cheeks pink from the cold, but her manner entirely unbothered, entirely composed. A woman who had just weathered the worst storm of the decade with no more evident strain than if she had sat through a heavy rain. He sat on his horse for a long moment, looking at the house, and then looking at her, and something in his weathered face shifted, some old certainty finally giving way under the plain evidence in front of him. "You made it through," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I told you I would," Rosalind said, and went on shoveling. "The barn near came down on my horses," Otis said, and there was something almost raw in his voice now, the sound of a man forced to reckon publicly with a mistake he had made privately for months. "Lost near half my woodpile keeping the house from freezing solid around us. My Bertha, she was up all 3 nights feeding that stove, watching the children shiver even with the fire going." "I'm sorry to hear it," Rosalind said, and she meant it, because whatever satisfaction she might have privately allowed herself in that moment, she was not a woman who took pleasure in her neighbor's suffering, only in having been permitted, at last, to be right about something that mattered. Otis dismounted and stood looking at the low earthen walls, the grass roof, the deep-set window catching the pale morning light, and he shook his head slowly, not in mockery this time, but in something closer to wonder. "Your Edwin taught you this." "He tried to teach the whole settlement," Rosalind said. "Nobody wanted to listen to a foreigner talk about digging into the ground like an animal. I didn't fully believe him myself, if I'm honest with you, Mr. Kellerman, not until I had no other choice but to trust what he'd told me." "Well," Otis said, and it seemed to cost him something to say it, the way it costs a proud man something to admit he has been wrong in front of the very person he doubted. "I reckon the whole settlement ought to start listening now." That admission, offered awkwardly on a cold morning, with the wreckage of the storm still scattered across the prairie, marked the beginning of a change that would reshape the settlement over the following 2 years. Word of what had happened, of the frame houses battered and half-ruined, while the Badger widow's earthen home stood through the worst storm in living memory without so much as a cracked window, spread through the county far faster and far more thoroughly than the earlier mockery ever had. By the following spring, 3 other families had approached Rosalind, asking her to walk their land with them and show them how to choose a proper slope, how to cut and lay sod for a roof that would shed snow and grow root-bound and strong, how to set a window to catch the low winter sun. Otis Kellerman himself, in what the whole settlement agreed was the surest sign of how thoroughly he had been humbled, spent that spring building a second, smaller, earth-sheltered structure into the same hillside as his barn, sheltered housing for his most valuable stock, and he told anyone who asked that he had learned the idea from the finest builder in the territory, a claim that made Rosalind laugh out loud the first time she heard it repeated back to her. Within 3 years, a visitor riding the county road in winter would have seen, dotted along the hillsides where once only proud, drafty frame houses had stood exposed to the wind, a scattering of low, grass-covered mounds with smoke curling gently from hidden chimneys, small, deep-set windows catching the winter light. A whole settlement that had learned, at terrible cost, and through the stubborn courage of one young widow, that the prairie was not something to be fought and conquered from above, but something to be listened to, understood, and built into so that its own patient, ancient warmth could become a family's shelter rather than its enemy. Rosalind Hartwell never remarried, though she was asked more than once, and she lived on that same rise of land for the rest of her days, her home slowly settling deeper and more permanently into the hillside with each passing year, until the two, house and earth, seemed almost to have become a single living thing, exactly as her husband had once told her a home was always meant to be. The moral the old settlers used to draw from her story, when they told it to their own children and grandchildren on winter evenings decades later, was not really about sod houses or blizzards at all, though those were the details that made the story worth telling around a fire. It was about the particular, quiet courage it takes to build your life according to a wisdom the world around you refuses to respect. To keep faith with an idea simply because you have tested it and found it true, even while everyone you know is laughing at you for it. The world is full of proud, tall structures built to be admired from the road, and it is full of people who would rather freeze inside something impressive than survive inside something humble. Rosalind Hartwell chose to survive, and in choosing that, she taught an entire settlement a lesson about the difference between building for appearance and building for truth, a lesson the prairie itself delivered with a wind that howled for 3 days and nights and could not find its way through a single grass-covered wall. If a story like this one means something to you, if you believe the world is full of forgotten innovators whose quiet genius deserves to be remembered instead of laughed at, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more stories like it, because there are countless more of these hidden histories waiting to be told. And before you go, leave a comment and tell me about someone you have known in your own life or in the stories passed down in your own family who was mocked for doing things differently and was later proven right. I would love to hear it.